All right, so talking about federal land use, we need to discuss all of the different government lands. So, this is a map of government lands as of 1995. I know it's a little dated, but it has not changed much since then. If we're looking at federal lands, BLM is the yellow, and that is most of the federal lands. And BLM stands for the Bureau of Land Management. And if we're looking at this, if you look specifically at the state of Nevada, so over here, 95% of the state of Nevada is actually federally owned, which is kind of crazy. Very little of the state is actually private. Next, in most land area owned by the federal government, we have the USDA. So that is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So that is also falling under national forests and different things of that nature. And next, we have the red, which is NPS, that is the National Park Service. So those are all of the national parks that are all over the United States. Orange Corps, that is the Army Corps of Engineers. USFWS, that is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then we go down from there with Indian reservations, TVA, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority, military, reclaimed land, and other federal. In state, we also have state parks. So if you look specifically at New York State, there's a very large state park in upstate New York. I believe that is, oh my gosh, now I'm blanking on it. I'll remember it later. Lake Placid. It's near Lake Placid, Acadia National or State Park, I believe. Then we have wildlife refuges, state forests, and all of those different areas. So, when we talked in the first lesson about Teddy Roosevelt and the era of conservation, he created these national systems. So, the U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service. We have a little bit more modern concepts as well as wilderness areas. So these are areas of preservation. So wilderness areas cannot be messed with at all. In wilderness areas, only foot or horseback can actually travel in them. And in a lot of areas, wilderness is designated by elevation. So, for example, in the state of Montana and Wyoming, anything above 8,000 feet of elevation is federal wilderness. We also have national recreation areas, national scenic areas, and national wild and scenic rivers as a part of these different preservation and conservation efforts. When we're looking at some different organizations that are private organizations as well as public organizations that also preserve and conserve land, National Park Service, so that is an organization within the federal government. But then underneath that, we have a bunch of different private organizations like the Sierra Club, Safari Club International, Rocky Mountain Elk, and so on and so on. A lot of these organizations, as you can see, are hunting organizations. This seems counterproductive to a lot of people because a lot of people think, well, if they're hunting organizations, don't they just want to hunt all the animals? Well, the animals need to live on land and they need to live on well managed land to be healthy and have sustainable populations to hunt year after year. So that is why they are very, very concerned with preservation and conservation. Some of the people involved, I have a list there. Those are the people we talked about in our first lesson. So, going through all of the different services that you guys need to know, we are going to start off with the U.S. Forest Service. So, what the Forest Service manages is about 25% of federal lands. It's almost 200 million acres. And within that, we have national forests and national grasslands. And actually, if you look at Wisconsin, we do have some national forests in the northern part of our state, which is pretty cool. This organization also works with state and private forestry. So in Wisconsin, if you want the Forest Service to give you some pointers about your land, they will and they can send a forester out because they want you to also manage your private land because that helps them to manage public land. If we're looking at a map of the whole United States, of private versus public of just forest land, it is very, very interesting. So, one pattern that you can probably notice is that the eastern part of the United States is primarily privately owned forests, whereas as we go farther west, we have more publicly owned forests. Part of the reason of that is the way that we actually discovered the United States and not necessarily discovered the United States, but settled the United States. So, what happened is we came from the Atlantic Ocean. We privately settled a lot of that area. And then in the middle, where it says non forest land, that is a lot of grasslands. And then we expanded to the west. So, a lot of those western lands, people had a very hard time getting there, therefore, a very hard time homesteading those lands, and they remained within the public domain. The mission of the U.S. Forest Service is to manage for sustained yield. So on U.S. Forest Service land, we can recreate, we can hunt, we can forage. So you can go look for mushrooms and different things like that. We can do silviculture. So what that means is we can actually log and cut down trees. However, we have to do it sustainably. We're not going to clear cut. We are going to use good practices for those areas. So when we're looking at land use, a lot of the land can be logged, mined, and used for recreation, as I said before. These areas that are designated as wilderness prohibit logging, mining, road building. So some of the areas under the U.S. Forest Service that are wilderness land cannot be touched. And since 1978, there are a bunch of presidents who have directed the USFS to administer national monuments inside of national forests. So, for an example, Giant Sequoia National Monument is a big patch of giant sequoia trees that are within a national forest because we're like, hey, we probably shouldn't chop these down because they're giant sequoia trees. So it's not necessarily a national park, but it is a protected land that cannot be used. So it is a preserved land within a conserved area. The U.S. Forest Service is also concerned with fire suppression. We will talk much, much more about fire suppression in a later unit. So just to kind of scratch the surface, in the early 1900s, there were so many fires that burned like entire states. When people started inhabiting these areas, they were like, hey, fire is really bad. It's burning down my house. So it became a rule to suppress all fires by 10 o'clock the next morning. They called it the 10 o'clock rule. However, what happened with this 10 o'clock rule is now we have created a tinderbox in the West because we have stopped all forest fires. What this has done is it's caused trees to grow very, very large, and it's caused deadfall trees that don't rot because it's not humid in the western part of the United States to just sit there. And when we do have fires that are natural and come through, they are bigger and they burn faster than ever. Within the U.S. Forest Service, you can be a wildland firefighter. So the picture in the background is a picture of wildland firefighters. They're also aided by the U.S. Army and also special elite forces of wildland firefighters called smoke jumpers. So in particularly bad fires or really rugged terrain, these people are actually able to parachute into fires with their gear to actually make breaks and different things like that in the firewall. And we'll learn more about that much later. It's really, really cool. So, Bureau of Land Management. What the Bureau of Land Management was is it started with the General Land Office, and then they wanted to encourage homesteading. So in 1862, there was an act called the Homestead Act, and if you went west, you could inhabit 160 acres of public land, and if you could prove that you could live there and cultivate the land and make it thrive for 5 years, that land was yours. In 1946, that General Land Office switched over to being called the BLM, and it was a merging of the General Land Office and the U.S. Grazing Service. So what the BLM manages is about 245 million surface acres, but also 700 million acres of subsurface mineral estates. So what they are doing is coal mining, they are doing oil, different minerals, things like that. And the really, really cool thing about BLM land is that they manage for multiple uses. So, for example, if we have land that is set aside for natural gas mining, that land can also be grazed. So, we'll talk about the Homestead Act first. So, this is an ad for the Homestead Act. So, Nebraska, they wanted people to go live there. So, you could get 80 acres inside of the railroad or 160 acres outside for $18 if you could live there for 5 years. So, some pretty cool stuff. A lot of really, really cool U.S. history about the Homestead Act. These are some BLM lands and also the subsurface mineral lands. So if you notice, once again, in northern Wisconsin, we do have BLM subsurface mineral lands. We have a county called Iron County, and there are a lot of iron mines in that area, and you can actually see that county shaded in northern Wisconsin. The BLM owns the rights to all of that iron that can be mined. We have multiple surface use act, and once again, I was talking about grazing. So the Taylor Grazing Act is something that is still used today. And what farmers can do, especially in the Western United States, is per year they can actually pay the BLM to graze their cattle on these public lands. So a couple years ago, I haven't looked up what the current prices are, but it was about 35 cents a head. So one cow is considered a head. So a farmer, if they had 100 cows, they would pay about $340 to the federal government to let them graze on that land for 1 year. And then in the winter, the farmer would take those cattle off the land, bring them back to his home range or their farm, keep them there for the winter. So really, really cool thing that can happen. So these grazing allotments, right now they have about 18,000 permits and leases that are held by ranchers who can graze their livestock there. So that picture is actually from the camp I work at in Wyoming, and we did not have a cattle fence around our private land that our cabins are on, and all around us is public land that has grazing allotments. It's U.S. Forest Service and BLM land. And of course, the cows don't know that. So every once in a while, we get herds of cattle that will come from that Forest Service and BLM land that have grazing allotments, and they will wander into camp. And then, as somebody from Wisconsin, it is my job to go around with a four-wheeler and chase all the cows away. But when they put the cows on the land, fun fact, they also put them there with several large bulls, because large bulls are known to take down grizzly bears that try to attack the calves. So you have to be very careful. So with this as well, we also have our wilderness area. So these are pictures, once again, from the camp I work at out west. Right across from the camp is a giant ridge that goes up about 1,000 feet in less than a mile. So I climb up that a couple times a year, and there is a sign at 8,000 feet of elevation that says National Forest Wilderness Land, area closed to motor vehicles and motorized equipment. And really, really cool. And it's public law that that area cannot be touched. So it's completely pristine and natural. All right. The last one that we are going to talk about is my favorite, the National Park Service. So these are pictures from a couple different national parks. So we have Old Faithful from Yellowstone National Park. The one in the middle is of Yosemite Falls in Yosemite Valley of Yosemite National Park. And then, of course, the Grand Canyon. So these were a couple of our first national parks. The National Park Service was established with a separate mandate for each park. So what that means is each park has its own goal and concept. So the general concept is for visitors to come, but also preserve the park, which is kind of a little bit of a conflict, because in order to have visitors, we need to make roadways, and doing that is not necessarily preservation. So it's a little bit of a conflict, but they do the best that they can. And there's a lot of attempts with National Park Service that balance these management goals with visitor use, and it becomes very, very tricky at times, especially in some of the busier parks. So this is a map of a lot of national lake shores, national parks, as well as other areas and lands that are under the National Park Service. So there's a lot of areas that are not necessarily national parks that fall with under their jurisdiction. For example, in Hawaii, if you look down at the bottom, there are only two national parks, Haleaka and Hawaii Volcanoes. However, there's also another land called Papa, I think, that is not a national park, but it is land that is preserved with under the National Park Service umbrella. So the beginnings of this act were in 1872 when Congress established Yellowstone National Park, and they put it under the Secretary of the Interior. Then what happened is national parks were actually put under the War Department. The very first park rangers were actually U.S. Army soldiers. So kind of interesting. A lot of their first mandates with national parks were predator eradication. So in Yellowstone National Park specifically, soldiers went around and their orders were to kill every single predator. And they managed to eradicate all mountain lions and wolves from Yellowstone National Park. This was under our old, regime of doing things. However, now what we are doing is we are reintroducing these species because we understand how important it is to have balance between all of these different species. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson officially made the Organic Act. What that did is it created the National Park Service as a separate entity. So Teddy Roosevelt, he did the idea of national parks, put them under the Department of the Interior and the War Department, put the lands aside. Woodrow Wilson officially created the Park Service. And then there are 35 current national parks and monuments, and a lot of other lands and monuments that are underneath that umbrella of the National Park Service.